What's up everybody, how's it going? It's Burke aka Dansgreat here, and in this video we are going to discuss Final Fantasy X-3. So a while back I made a video about why I currently do not want a Final Fantasy X-3 to be made. So if you haven't seen that one, I'd recommend you check it out because that's going to inform what I'm going to say in this video. But now it's time to talk about what would happen if there was a Final Fantasy X-3, but Square Enix scrapped the canon that was in like the novella and the audio drama, and it decided to go for a new story or a prequel story. So let's get into it and talk about it. So when it comes to Final Fantasy X-3, based on all of the conversations I've had with fans, based on comments I've gotten on videos and discussions and all that kind of stuff, it's pretty clear to me that the most popular choice from the community for Final Fantasy X-3 is a prequel story featuring Jecht, Braska and Auron, and people want to see their pilgrimage and their journey as a full game. So let's talk about that first, because that is the game that most people would want to see, and as things stand, that is the game that I would want to see as well. Because if you're asking me, do you want to carry on from whatever story has been set up with Sin's Return and the Beckoning and all this stuff that I mentioned in the previous video, or would you prefer a prequel game? Of course I would choose the prequel as well. So let's talk about how that could work, what are the downfalls of it, and overall what could we expect from such a game. So first of all, I'll talk about the more negative side of things. What is it that doesn't motivate me or excite me about a potential prequel? And then we'll move on to some ways in which it could and it will work. My conclusion at the end of the first video was that as things stand right now, I do not want a Final Fantasy X-3 because I've made the assumption that if there is a X-3, it's going to follow on from the canon that had been set up previously. Now, if Square Enix were to make an announcement and say we're making a Final Fantasy X-3, we've scrapped the novella and the audio drama, we've decided to make a X-3 about Braska, Auron and Jecht's journey. That is something I could definitely get behind. Would I be really hyped for it? Maybe not, but it's definitely something that I would get behind, and I'd definitely be on the yes, I want to see this made and I want to play this side, as opposed to, oh man, like why are they making a X-3 with this story? They're going to ruin it. So that's the overall opinion that I have of this particular X-3. But let's talk about some of the negatives and some things that don't excite me about it. So of course the most important thing and the most obvious problem I think with X-3 being this story would be the fact that we've pretty much seen all of the most dramatic beats and peaks of the story already in Final Fantasy X. Because of the flashback system that the game has and like the way the spheres store memories, and you've got the Xanacan Dome which has the fireflies which can hold people's thoughts there and all that kind of stuff. Basically, a large portion of the most dramatic moments of their story have literally already played out in front of our eyes. It's going to be very difficult to completely remake those scenes in a way that makes them that much more powerful, because you already know exactly what they said to each other, how the events played out, how they reacted to things, etc. So some examples of situations that are going to suffer as a result of this, I think, are things like Auron, when he realizes what's going to happen, and he begs for Braska to not continue with this because he knows that he's going to sacrifice himself. You got the scene with Jecht, when Jecht decides that he's going to be the one to become the final Aeon. He's going to sacrifice his life, and he leaves Tidus in the hands of Auron and says, look after my son. These are all really powerful and very, very important scenes in the narrative, and we've already seen them play out in Final Fantasy X already. There's a scene when Braska and Auron first find Jecht, how they react to him, and all of that kind of stuff. So this is an issue because there's not going to be that many narrative surprises. Think back to Final Fantasy X and the first time that you played through the game. Some of the biggest reasons why I was drawn to Final Fantasy X, and as the game went on I got so attached to it, was because you learn the nature of Spira, you learn the nature of what it means to be a summoner, you learn about the sacrifices that are needed and all that kind of stuff. So as that continues, you're learning new information all the time because you're obviously in Tidus' shoes during this experience. So you find out that Yuna's going to die, you find out that a summoner has to sacrifice themselves, you find out that Sin is going to come back even if Yuna does sacrifice herself. So you're being told all of these things, and as you experience and absorb them, they have a much heavier emotional weight than, let's say, subsequent playthroughs when you get given the same information. So imagine it that way, because we've seen it once already through Yuna's journey. We saw the same things play out a second time through Braska's journey, through those flashbacks and those spheres, and now we're going to have exactly the same thing playing out a third time. Now, you might say, I love it so much that I don't care that it's playing out a third time. You know, I'm still going to love it. I'm still going to get emotional. I'm still going to cry. It's still going to be hugely powerful for me and all that kind of stuff. These are all completely valid reactions to what I'm saying. But for me personally, I think, well, of course it's still going to be good if they do it the right way. It's not going to be like I'm going to watch these scenes and have absolutely no reaction to it and feel nothing. But you can't take away from the fact that we've already just seen all of this play out. And we've seen it play out in multiple ways. And how many new things is that going to leave for us to experience? How many more twists and turns can we see in the story if all of the biggest ones have already been revealed to us in Final Fantasy X? So narratively, this is one of my biggest concerns. The fact that most of the dramatic parts of the story have already been told and we've already seen it. If it was, let's say, extremely brief, like you got like a very, dreamy, momentary flashback thing, then maybe it's definitely much more relevant. But the fact that we literally saw a lot of these scenes fully play out with the full dialogue for multiple minutes, then I feel like it's a little bit different, and there's a chance that it just might not work as well for that reason. So that's things from a narrative and dialogue standpoint, but you also have to remember that this game is set in exactly the same place. It's going to be set in the same temples. They have to do exactly the same pilgrimage that we did in Final Fantasy X, and because it's only 10 years prior, not a lot would have changed. So if this was like a really crazy prequel, so if it was like 500 years ago, you're not going to know anybody from that world. The towns are going to look different and all that kind of stuff. But here, pretty much everything is going to look exactly the same. So the Cloister of Trials are going to be identical. The temples themselves are going to be identical. I don't know, like the towns and the cities are all going to look very similar. So Final Fantasy X-2 already kind of banked on the fact that we love Spire enough that we won't care that we're visiting the same places. But to do this again for a third time, and the fact that you're making the narrative pretty much exactly like you did the first time, because of course one of the strengths I believe of Final Fantasy X-2 is that they didn't try and copy Final Fantasy X. They went a completely different route. It was much more open, it was much more exploratory, the things they had to do were different, the atmosphere was different, etc. But for X-3, it's going to be a parallel of what happened in Final Fantasy X. You're going to have the same kind of situations, the same problems. Jecht and Tidus are going to be feeling very similar things as they've been taken away from their home. We're going to have the same issues about sacrifice and people not wanting to lose who they love. They're going to learn about the fact that all of this is futile because sin is going to keep coming back. Of course, we already know the ending. That's one of the most important things about this whole thing. We know the ending and we know the aftermath of what happens as well. The attitudes to these things are going to be a little bit different perhaps, but all in all, I mean, in terms of what you're going to see, what you're going to do and what you're going to experience is going to overlap really, really heavily with Final Fantasy X. So that's something that I would definitely be concerned about. Again, this isn't just like dismissing the idea totally, so me saying these things doesn't mean that for these reasons I definitely think it's going to suck, but these are things that I definitely do think about when it comes to a Final Fantasy X-3 with Jecht, Braska and Auron. So these are some of my biggest concerns when it comes to a X-3 featuring that trio. Now, despite everything I've said, this prequel could definitely still work, and it could still be an absolutely amazing game. So let's talk about the ways in which it can work. First of all, we live in a time when forget prequels, even reboots are doing hugely well. There's a lot of reboots where you know the story, you know how it's going to play out, you know who's going to win, you know who's going to die and all that kind of stuff, but people still love it anyway because it's still a fresh way to experience a story that you already know. So for me, a X-3 featuring this trio would kind of be like half prequel and half reboot, because the prequel is going to follow the same story pretty much as Final Fantasy X did, but of course it's going to be a prequel of that story. So it's going to be a bit of a weird hybrid between reboot, because it's going to have a new console, it's going to have new technology, and it's going to have obviously some new elements to the story and some different characters that weren't there last time, but at its core it's going to be a very similar thing to Final Fantasy X, and it's going to be a reboot of the stuff that we already saw in Final Fantasy X concerning this trio. But as we've seen from the movie industry and all of the remakes and the remasters that we get nowadays, the fact that a lot of this stuff is going to be repeated and it's not going to be new content narratively or maybe even in terms of gameplay, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So you could completely spin what I said in the first 5-10 minutes and say that that's a good thing, because at the end of the day, so many of us love Final Fantasy X really dearly. If we had another game that pretty much played similarly to Final Fantasy X, was set in the same world, it had a similar kind of atmosphere, It contains some of our favourite characters, and we got to experience that for 30-40 hours, and we get to fully experience a story that was kind of shown to us in parts in the first game. That's definitely something that can be appealing. So maybe like 10 years ago, a 10.3 wasn't as good an idea, but I think the way that the creative industries have changed nowadays, original stories are not only, I think, a bit more difficult to come up with, but I think they're also a greater risk for studios and for developers and all that kind of stuff. You can see a myriad of examples of studios and developers playing it safe with reboots, with remasters. We've reached that kind of era in the media and entertainment industry. So if anything, it's a good time for a Final Fantasy X-3 type thing to happen. So definitely in terms of what the climate is like right now, a X-3 that is a prequel definitely doesn't seem like it would put a lot of people off. I think most people are going to be very hyped and very excited about it if there was a prequel X-3. Of course, the main reason why a X-3 I think would work really well is because that front three is going to be so strong, because they're very popular characters. Auron, I don't need to say anything that I haven't already said about Auron. He's just amazing. You've got Jecht, who has a huge fan base as well, and his story is very interesting. His arc of being like this really arrogant, self-centered, rude, annoying man who only cares about himself, turning into this guy that's willing to sacrifice his life in order to help a friend defeat sin and to bring peace to the world, and for his life to have actually meant something beyond just being a famous blitzer, I think is something really powerful. And we're definitely going to enjoy seeing that journey and that transformation in Jecht, because obviously we get told about it and we see it through like a few minutes of cutscenes in the game, but to live this journey through like a 20, 30, 40 hour story, I think it's going to be even better. So Jecht's character arc is going to be fantastic. Auron is interesting because we obviously know a lot about him through Final Fantasy X and through all of the flashback scenes that we see of his pilgrimage. But what we don't know is a lot about his past before he meets Braska. So this game might be an excuse to expand upon Auron's story and to see more of his youth and to see how he came up through the ranks. He used to be like a devoted Yevon follower. How did that all change? You had his thing where he refused the hand of the priest's daughter. That changed his life. So there's a lot of missing spaces in Auron's story. And of course a X-3 is going to give us a chance to fill some of that out even more and make Auron an even more complete character as we get more of his timeline. So I think Auron has a lot of potential in a X-3 as well. And of course Braska, the same thing would apply, because we only know of what happened to him during his pilgrimage. You have the cool story of him meeting Yuna's mum and then running away together and all that kind of stuff. That's an interesting narrative too. So one thing that we didn't get too much as a result of it being a flashback, of course, is the story of what happened before they became this trio and went on to defeat Sin. So there's a lot of scope to have flashbacks and to have extra cutscenes, extra exposition, extra dialogue to help fill out these characters completely and to get a clearer picture of who these guys were and how did they become who they were. So I think that would be really interesting. So why did Braska become a summoner, for example? What were his parents like, etc. I think there's a lot of scope to see lots of different things that you wouldn't have seen before. New characters. Then when you start going back to their childhood as well, then you're starting to go more like 30, 40 years back from the Final Fantasy X story. So then it could be even more interesting, because then you're going to have interesting like younger characters. Maester Micah's going to be younger, for example. So then you're going to have a little bit more scope for different stuff happening as well. So just in terms of our trio and what we can gain from having a prequel, I think there's a lot to be gained there. Because they're already very strong characters, very well loved characters, I think there's very little chance of a prequel featuring these three doing badly on that front. So I think in terms of story and in terms of character, all of the ingredients are there to make a great experience. One of the things I hear most about Final Fantasy these days is people talk a lot about battle systems. And of course Final Fantasy VII Remake is coming out soon, and one of the biggest talking points of Final Fantasy VII Remake, other than what happened to Tifa's breast, was the battle system. Now I have no data to back this up, but personal opinion, I think that the Final Fantasy fanbase is starting to age. Now I don't mean this in like a negative way, I'm one of these people myself, but I think when Final Fantasy was in its golden age, which I would say is between like Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy X, a lot of us were either just small children or we were like younger, we were in our teens. There weren't a lot of like 30-year-old, 35-year-old Final Fantasy players in the late 90s. So now when you look at the Final Fantasy fan base, because there hasn't been that many new games pumped out in the last 10 years, I think a lot of the Final Fantasy fan base are people around my age, people like 10, 15 years older than me, and maybe people 5 or 10 years younger than I am. We've been playing games for a long time. We're used to certain systems. A lot of us have come up from between like Final Fantasy 7 and Final Fantasy 10. So we're used to the ATB, we're used to like weight systems. People like me are obviously extremely used to the turn-based system. So when it comes to what kind of gameplay does the Final Fantasy community want from its new games, I think the community is more after some of that old school feel than maybe Square Enix themselves are. Because you can see in their more recent games, they made a push to have much more dynamic, fast-paced action kind of gameplay systems. Final Fantasy 13 sped things up a bit. It even introduced an auto battle because selecting manual moves while the ATB moves along is actually quite difficult. So they even introduced an auto system to make that easier for new players until you really learn the system. Final Fantasy 15 took that even a step further. It started to become much more action-based. You had like parries and all this kind of business. That stuff that's from what I know at least. I haven't played any of the really old Final Fantasies, but I'm pretty sure that's a new kind of gameplay that didn't used to exist before. Based on what I know about this stuff, Square Enix, obviously as the hardware improves, the technology improves, you start to get more realistic looking games and worlds being built. Having turn-based systems, I think, doesn't work as well like in the modern age and with the modern graphics that we have today. And their push, I think, is to have their games play in the same way that their animated movies look. So let's say the fight scenes in Advent Children, they want some of that kind of fluidity because obviously everything looks really nice in those movies and they probably want to translate some more of that action into the main gameplay because their games are much more closer to looking like those movies now. I mean, if you look at Final Fantasy VII and you look at Advent Children, they look very different. If you look at Final Fantasy 15 and you look at Advent Children, it's much more similar. So there is obviously a natural progression and a move towards a more fluid and dynamic battle system. But I think especially with the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Square Enix have really understood the fact that most of their players still like that old school system, and especially if they're playing an old school game, they don't mind using the old school system. So it's okay to play with an ATB style system, even when games look the way they do now. That's always been my personal opinion. Obviously there's a lot of people that still love the newer battle systems and like the more high-paced, high-energy battles that you have. But I think a lot of us, like a lot of you guys watching this video, will be fans of the older kind of ATB, weight mode, conditional turn-based system. And I think that Square Enix, through their kind of hybrid battle system in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, have proved that they're listening to fans in this sense, and they want to have this kind of appeal going on in their games as well, especially when their games are remakes of old classics. So Final Fantasy VII Remake is promising in that sense because you can play it the way you want to play it. This is again based on like trailers that I've seen, little snippets of gameplay, etc. But it's looking to me like if you want to go the more modern route and you want to have your fast-paced battle, you can do that. Or you can have the more kind of old school calculated style of battle system where you can take some more time to pick your moves and treat it a bit more like a classical ATB system than a game like Final Fantasy 15, let's say. So that's all good news, and I'm going to extend this further and say that if they do a 10.3, I think it's a perfect opportunity to bring back the turn-based battle system of Final Fantasy X. I believe that Final Fantasy X, in terms of it, like the mainline Final Fantasy series, is the only game that has a conditional turn-based system in that way. Now, it's a system that did divide players a little bit. Some people didn't like that. They prefer like the ATB system over the CTB system. But obviously because I came up through that, that's the first Final Fantasy I ever played, that's what I learned. It molded me into who I am today. So it's so heavily influenced my taste in battle systems that it's hard for me to not have any bias towards it because my opinion has literally been formed by playing Final Fantasy X for so long. But I'm sure that Square Enix is smart enough to know that if they're making a Final Fantasy X-3, most of the people buying that game are going to be huge fans of Final Fantasy X, and huge fans of Final Fantasy X, on average, will enjoy the CTB system. So this is a great chance to make a modern game that you know is going to sell well, because if you make it a prequel, you have those three headlining that game. You know that those Final Fantasy X fans are going to be all over that, me included. I'm of course going to buy the game and I'm going to be excited for it because I'd want to go on this journey too. So with all of this being said, there is not a better opportunity to bring back the old school CTB system to a modern Final Fantasy game. So that's one of the coolest things that could come out of the Final Fantasy X-3 if it ever gets made. This isn't specific to it being a prequel. I mean, they could still do the same thing even if it was a continuation of the canon story, but this is like my dream kind of Final Fantasy X. So if it was the prequel and we did have the CTB system making a comeback with like a more modern refinement perhaps to make it even better and make it even more suited to the kind of look that the game is going to have, I think it could be amazing. So that's one thing that would excite me about a potential Final Fantasy X-3. I think the fact the Final Fantasy VII Remake is being made right now is a very good indicator of whether a Final Fantasy X-3 A could be possible in the future, and B, could it actually be any good? Because some of the stuff that I've already mentioned here is going to be relevant for Final Fantasy VII Remake as well, because that is quite literally the same game repeated, but they want you to experience it in a new way. So once we do play that game, and we see that even if we have love for Final Fantasy VII the original, this remake was done in a way where we can still appreciate both games, then that would be a good indicator of whether Square Enix could pull off a Final Fantasy X-3, especially if they were to have it as a prequel. Because they would have proved that they can work a known narrative in a new way and give us a way to experience the game differently. This is close to being the exact same problem you'd have with a Final Fantasy X-3 that featured the trio. So if they handle it well in the remake, that bodes well for the future. So that's always a good sign. And of course the biggest thing about making a Final Fantasy X-3 with the trio would be what else are you bringing to the table. So narratively, I've discussed that stuff. In terms of the world, I mean, it could be interesting. At the end of the day, we're going to be seeing a new Sin. So one thing that people have asked me before is, does Sin always look the same? I personally think it does, because Yu Yevon is always using the same faith in order to create Sin. So I believe, yes, it always looks the same. But for example, we're going to have Yoken's final Aeon. So Yoken's final Aeon is going to look completely different. And one thing that's interesting timeline-wise is that there has been a really, really long gap between Yoken defeating Sin and Braska defeating Sin. So when we play Final Fantasy X, it's only actually been 10 years. And when you look back at Spear in history, Sin has only been defeated, I think, 5 times in total, over 1,000 years. So one way in which the narrative could be very interesting is, what does a Spearer that hasn't experienced a calm for like 100 years, 150 years, look like? So that could be a very interesting new angle that we'll be able to see if there was a prequel, and that's something that would be quite exciting. You're going to have a totally new final Aeon to fight against. You have no idea what it's going to look like. Maybe in the same way that we saw Braska's journey, we'll be able to see Lady Yoken's journey in a Final Fantasy X-3. So that could be something that's really interesting, because her journey was even more different, because I think she only had one guardian. So it was a summoner with only a single guardian, and they managed to somehow defeat Sin, just the 2 of them. So that's an interesting narrative that they can explore as well. Another really interesting thing is that there are a lot of questions in the community about how exactly does the final summoning work? How does it kill the summoner? Do they die at the point of summoning, or they summon it, they fight together, then Yu Yevon possesses the final Aeon, then uses that possessed final Aeon to kill the summoner? Or just is it the fact that transforming and summoning this final Aeon takes so much out of the summoner that the process kills them? These are questions that have always lingered in the community. I have my own opinions on them that I've shared before. I personally think it's Yu Yevon possesses the new Aeon and it kills the summoner thing. And I'm pretty sure that's correct. But one reason why Final Fantasy X-3 again would be interesting is because you're going to see that process happen for the first time. The ending of that game is going to be really freaking tragic, because what's going to happen? It's going to be Braska agreeing to sacrifice himself, Jecht agreeing to sacrifice himself, Auron just being completely broken by this whole experience because 2 of his best friends are both going to give their life to what he believes and what is later known to be a futile cause. And you're going to see all of that play out. That's going to be pretty crazy. So what's going to happen when Braska summons his final Aeon for the first time? How does his death happen? What's Auron's reaction to it? All of that kind of stuff. These are really powerful elements of the story that you don't see later on. So this is like one important missing dramatic element of their story that really can be worked in Final Fantasy X-3 and give you like a really, probably in some ways bittersweet, because they still defeat Sin, and you know that eventually, like after the events of Final Fantasy X, that it's going to be all good in the end. but it's going to be like one of those really hard-hitting endings, I think, with Braska and Jecht's death. So that's also a new thing that they're going to bring to the game as well. So based on everything I've said, I think it's clear that Square Enix's best bet for a Final Fantasy X-3 is just to work the prequel, because it's going to get the backing of most of the fans, because currently the narrative that they have with the novella and the audio drama is not something that has the backing of a lot of fans, so you're more likely to sell more copies of your game if it's a prequel. You have a lot of that story mapped out already, your characters are ready, your locations are ready, the journey is ready. All you have to do is add in the extras that you want to add in to help flesh out their story, and ways to innovate the experience to bring it to like a modern day gamer who's played a lot of more modern games than they would have when they first played Final Fantasy X. So I feel like it's an easier task, but it's also the correct choice here, because the only other option I think alongside all of this stuff is to say we're going to scrap the novella and the drama. We're not doing a prequel because of the stuff I talked about early on, like we don't want to tread over old ground, we don't want to tell the story that we partially already told in Final Fantasy X. We're going to come up with a completely new story, and hopefully this will satisfy the fans. Now, do I think that it's possible for them to do that? I think it is. But is it likely to happen? I think not. Because do remember that this is it's going to be a third entry in a series that you haven't had a new game for 15 years as of now. So in terms of Square Enix's resources, I really don't think that they're going to be dedicating any major resources to trying to make a Final Fantasy X-3 from scratch. How it could potentially play out is they're continuing with Final Fantasy VII Remake. Let's say that does super well. There's a few more games to come in that list anyway. Maybe once Final Fantasy VII is done, they'll be working on a Final Fantasy XVI, and alongside that maybe they'll have like a smaller sub-team to work on X-3. Because they already have the narrative in place, they don't have to design that many new primary characters, they don't have to design a new world and all that stuff. Maybe like the original people like Kitase and stuff can supervise the whole situation while they work on Final Fantasy XVI, but when it comes to Final Fantasy X-3, they'll give it to maybe like more junior members of Square Enix, the up-and-comers, and they will just supervise them as they craft Final Fantasy X-3. So due to resources and due to their other commitments, other games that they're going to be making, I really don't think Square Enix is going to turn around and say, okay, we're going to do everything from scratch, we're making a completely new narrative for Final Fantasy X-3 and all that business. It just doesn't feel realistic to me. If they did, it's extremely hard to figure out how it could work, because we've seen that any angle that uses Sin once more, I think it's just going to be an instant flop, and it's going to get instant rejection from the community, because one of the things we all hated most about the audio drama was the fact that Sin was returning. So if you take that out of the equation as well, what new threat could there potentially be? I mean, X-2 had a Final Fantasy X game without Sin in it, but I think that was a very specific situation, and I don't think it's something they could really replicate a second time. If you're not doing the prequel as well, then, I mean, the only thing that really leaves you is to go way back. So to go to like the Machina War of Bevel and Zanarkand like 1,000 years ago. But, I mean, what can you really construct there? Is it really worth your time, like going back there and creating all of this new lore that wouldn't have been explained before? All of these new stories, new characters, everything would look very, very different 1,000 years ago in Spira. All of this kind of business, I really just can't see it coming together anytime soon. So for me, I think there are currently 3 options. 1, you don't make a Final Fantasy X-3, you just leave it alone, and I'm perfectly okay with that. Absolutely no complaints about that. Fine. Someday maybe you'll make a remake for Final Fantasy X, like when we're on like PlayStation 6 or some shit. Then that's absolutely fine, you can remake Final Fantasy X, that's cool. But in terms of a X-3, if they never make one, I'm good with that. Option 2, Final Fantasy X-3 featuring a continuation of the audio drama. This I already spent an entire video on, so I'm just going to say no, absolutely do not want that to happen. Third option is, yes, we're making a X-3 and we're scrapping everything that we did for the novella and the audio drama, it's no longer canon. Or they could just say, okay, you know, we're not scrapping it, it's still canon, but at the end of the day we're doing a prequel now, so none of that matters anymore. We're not doing a game based on that stuff anymore. We're going back and we're doing a prequel of Jecht, Auron and Braska's story. That is something I would definitely get behind, and it's something that I think is definitely a much more realistic and profitable option for Square Enix if they ever choose to pursue it in the future. So there we go, guys. Those are my thoughts about Final Fantasy X-3. I'd love to see a prequel game because I really think it could give us that modern day Final Fantasy X throwback experience that so many of us would be looking for. And I think they definitely do a good enough job to satisfy most of us Final Fantasy X fans. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. Would you like to see a X-3? If you do, are you a prequel person, or are you okay with them continuing the audio drama? Or do you have some genius idea of how they could revamp the entire story and come up with something completely new? So look forward to reading your comments, and I will see you soon. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.